Welcome to the LMU History Department's summer web social media series, Viral Histories. We've developed a tradition in the department of doing History in the Headlines programs, where we bring a historical perspective to current events, hoping to better contextualize issues and to use our study of the past to help us understand the present. Viral Histories is a response to the current COVID situation, a series of conversations about pandemics, issues of public health, cultural practices around health and wellness, the role of the state, intersections of race and gender with health, and more. For our first episode, Thinking Beyond the Flu, I'm joined today by my colleague, Carla Bittel, a historian of medicine, science, and technology with a focus on the 19th century United States, as well as gender issues. Her first book was Mary Putnam Jacoby and the Politics of Medicine in 19th Century America, and she contributed to and co-edited the recently published Working with Paper, Gendered Practices in the History of Knowledge. She is currently working on a project on the history of phrenology and its practitioners. Thanks for joining us, Carla.
Thanks for having me.
So Carla, Professor Bittel, you teach a very popular course on health and disease in American culture, where you also talk about the history of the influenza pandemic of 1918. What was the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, and why was it called the Spanish flu?
Well, the 1918-1919 pandemic was really the worst pandemic in most recent history, and historians estimate that it killed potentially 50 million people worldwide and approximately about 675,000 Americans. And this flu was of an H1N1 origin and with genes of avian origin. And we're not exactly sure where it started, but it does acquire the name, quote, Spanish flu. And historians think that that came from the press in Europe and how the European presses were often talking about the cases in Spain. The King of Spain had influenza, and it became, that name stuck. And I think in the United States, it was a way of kind of explaining and talking about how it came from somewhere else, this kind of othering that tends to happen during these pandemics. We know that some in the Spanish press actually called it the, quote, French flu. So I think that it's it's really important to kind of think about where the naming comes from.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very much so. So how did you become interested in the 1918 pandemic? And in particular, how and why do you teach students about it?
I became really interested through my teaching, actually, because it was such a major world event that most students had never heard of. And most students have had the flu, right? And so for them to kind of think about that experience and the kind of extremes that took hold in 1918, the scope, they were really fascinated with it. And I think that, I teach it because, and I teach this course because it also, reminds us that health is history. And certainly the pandemic intersected with World War I, and wars are really important as well. But the really kind of personal experience of illness was something that came across to students through teaching them with primary sources and teaching them with archival sources. And several of my classes were lucky enough to collaborate with the UCLA Biomedical Library Special Collections, which allowed us access to a really nice collection of primary sources, letters, diaries, personal narratives, ephemera, things that personal items students could hold in their hand. And I think the material experience of having something that personal about this event really made it an important experience, and we got a lot of them into research. So it was, a research project for the course and so I continued to teach about it. And I think, it's the students were also fascinated with how it was the fact that how it was so forgotten, and there's one historian that calls it the quote forgotten pandemic,
Mhm.
and I think that issues of memory also make it an interesting case study.
Mhm. I know a number of students who have gone through that course and who talk about the research that they did with those archival documents, and how much they enjoyed really getting their hands on things and doing the kind of work that we as historians do all the time. I mean, that's what we hope to get out of our classes, right?
Yeah,
As much as possible. It's wonderful that you have this treasure trove of resources that you can use in teaching this course.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. So, as historians, we often make comparisons,
Mhm.
but we do so very cautiously.
Mhm.
So, why is the 1918 pandemic so often being compared to COVID-19 today? And is that a valuable comparison for us to make?
No, I think there are some real evident similarities and things that look and feel really familiar about it. And because it is so close to the 100th anniversary, I think it makes it, you know, I think kind of it's easy to say 100 years ago, right?
Mhm.
This happened, and so I do think there are some useful comparisons, and they've been discussed a lot by historians and journalists, but I think, a couple that stand out to me are, the visual culture. And I think that today, when we see people in masks in 1918, right, and we have our own, at the moment, kind of, contention around
Mhm.
wearing masks and the importance of wearing a mask. I think it's interesting to see that in the past, and to see also placards and instructions that really are that would go on things like streetcars, and people would find in post offices, and these things would instruct people on personal acts of prevention,
Mhm.
um, and coughing into a handkerchief, washing your hands, also not spitting. The anti-spitting campaign is something that's always interested me, because it goes back to the history of tuberculosis prevention, and it has I think a lot of interesting issues around it. So the visual culture, I think, is really one thing that is, again, very evident. I think also the uncertainty around medical knowledge that we have now about COVID-19 is something that was shared in 1918, did when it became apparent this wasn't the flu that people had experienced
Mhm.
before, when kind of new symptoms arose. And I think another thing that's an obvious comparison is how there was not an absolute treatment at that time, and today we also kind of struggle with how to best care for patients.
Mhm.
um, I think the lack of resources and preparation in our own time. We look to 1918, when the focus was on World War One. The focus in 19 was also on keeping people positive about World War One, and for that reason, there was a lot of, historians point to a lot of information and misinformation, or lack of of publicizing the real threat
Mhm.
of the virus. And so I think with our own um, problems of misinformation today, that's also a really kind of obvious comparison. And then I think a final one I mentioned, I think that we should actually pay more attention to, is the issue of vulnerable populations. And I think today, I think we're finally kind of taking a look at that, and inequalities around healthcare, and the way certain people have access and don't, and how that's impacting their experience with the virus. But in 1918, historians looked to death rates worldwide, and it's pretty clear that the death rates are a bit higher in the colonies, for example, and the colonial context, I think, is also an important one. So there are these obvious, comparisons, but I think that they can also be helpful for understanding our own time period.
Carla, here we can see a poster from the Alberta Provincial Board of Health that details a lot of the measures that you were just talking about that now seem so familiar to us today. So I think we can see why the comparisons between COVID and the flu are so powerful for so many people. But tell me, are there limits to those sorts of comparisons?
One thing I think is important is to think about how the memory of 1918 is being used in terms of our narratives of the present. And you know, I also think it's important not to oversimplify these comparisons.
Mhm.
Um, One thing that I get a little concerned about is that it looks familiar and that somehow potentially might be reassuring to us, because it was something that came and went. It was something that people quickly moved on from, and there was this kind of huge period of forgetting. And so I do have, you know, concerns that the comparison is also about kind of getting past it, when in fact this might be much longer than we think. We don't know. And I think we also, you know, need to think about new diseases that might be on the horizon.
Mhm.
Also, I think that public health is really complex. And so the comparisons between the different measures, I think, have to always kind of be seen in context. So, you know, for example, I mean, historians are interested in public health questions around sort of who has expertise, who has authority over one's health, and also questions about how potentially what are the measures being taken and were they targeted towards particular populations. And I think that's, you know, an important part of the early 20th century history of medicine, which is that we see that a lot of measures often had kind of a lot of moral undertone to them and instruction to them. And we see that a lot of things about cleanliness and Americanness were really
Mhm.
imposed on especially immigrant populations. And actually, that's really a good example of that is in Los Angeles. The historian Natalia Molina has written about, you know, looking at different issues of health and epidemics in the early 20th century in Southern California, and how categories of race were really constructed in relationship to illnesses, and how often that was used by public health authorities to define people as citizens or not. So I think that public health had a lot of power, and so it's important to kind of think about it in its time period, to think about how public health has, you know, saved many lives, countless lives, but also that it is a dynamic and changes over time, and also, you know, can we should look at how its relationship with certain populations.
Mhm. Mhm. So if there are limits to the comparison, then should we be looking to other perhaps disease histories or thinking beyond the flu, or at least to draw some different lessons or draw some different information perhaps?
Well, funny that you ask, because my course covers a lot of different disease histories, and historians have really been writing these disease histories, have created almost a whole library, you might say, of disease histories over time, because they do really give us access to a connection between private and public life.
Mhm.
And I think that that makes it great, you know, makes these great examples for teaching. But I also think for us today, it really connects. I think we can really use a lot of them as and find insights in them. For example, historians have written a lot about cholera in the 19th century, and that is also a history of immigration and the way
Mhm.
in which disease was associated with immigration, and the problems around uh, creating public health measures and instituting them,
Mhm.
and the tensions that surrounded that in places like New York, for example. Also, you know, I think historians look to urban outbreaks about things like bubonic plague or smallpox. I know we think of smallpox in this kind of like vast scope, but there were these smaller, or shorter, I should say, outbreaks in the 19th century. And especially in the late 19th century, some of them were associated with during a time of, you know, intense anti-Asian immigration. There was a lot of feelings. People called Chinese Americans, quote, the yellow, talked about the yellow peril, right?
Mhm.
And during that time, it was, often these plagues were equated, right, with the coming of new immigrants. And I think because of today and the way we see a lot of racism today and constructions of and associations between China and the virus, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really useful to look at how we have been there before with that. I also think we definitely need to look at one of the more recent, I should say, and most significant pandemics, which is the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which we are still in. We still don't have a vaccine for AIDS, but we certainly have new treatments. But in the 1980s, I think there were a lot of interesting, important stories to be told about the history of stigmatization and how that became so intense during the early years of AIDS. And then I also think the history of health activism, because those who really fought for knowledge and access to healthcare during the AIDS crisis, really, many of them did that as part of a movement. And I think that's really useful for us today too, to kind of look at that history.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. So you talked about earlier, you talked about inequities in the healthcare system. You talked about issues of racism just now. We're obviously at a moment right now where the pandemic is coinciding with movements for racial justice. So historically, what are some of the ways in which health and race have intersected? Can we think about health as a matter of justice?
Yeah, I would say health is definitely a matter of justice, and this is where history becomes really important for us. I think that we have to look at it in order to kind of understand how we got to where we are. And there's so many, I think, examples we can look at of social and economic determinants of health. And historians in the 19th century, for example, look to the US Civil War period, right? And the period that followed it, and the immediate years of emancipation, and how newly emancipated people, while that was extremely significant, that they often, were faced with a series of health crises due to dislocation and, of course, problems that arose during and after the war. We see how a lot of African Americans were faced with a lack of health care, with poor access to food. Were constantly on the move, sometimes with the Union Army, and the conditions in those camps could be really difficult. So in other words, I think that time period is really crucial, and historians have done recently, especially, shown how epidemics were also faced by newly emancipated peoples. But I'd say that if we continue along that chronology, we need to kind of look at the long history of segregation and how Jim Crow affected the health systems and became kind of built into the medical system, so that many people didn't have access to healthcare, and that, and the long-term impacts of that. So I think that's a really significant part of it. And then one final thing I would say is we need to, look at historically at biological racism, which has a really long history, but certainly we need to look at the abuses against African Americans, for example, in the medical system. Now, one that really often sticks out is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right, which took place between 1932 and 1972, when African American men with syphilis went untreated and were not properly informed about the conditions of the experiment. And while that episode and the ethical violation of it is so significant, I think historians have shown us how it also is a window onto inequality, and how inequalities were built into the health system, and how many of the subjects of the study and the people in their community had little access to healthcare. So it kind of opens up a broader history of segregation and the impacts of Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting. We'll actually be delving into those issues of racism and healthcare and health and wellness in a few weeks' time with Professor Marnie Campbell. So, Professor Bittel, any closing thoughts? How did we get here? How can history help explain things?
Well, my honors history courses in the spring tackled this problem, and I think it's a little bit early to be writing this history. And then, yet, I do think we need to look to history to kind of contextualize where we are and look at how major changes may have produced our current crisis. And so I think that, some of the things we talked about and look to the students, of course, are really interested in the problem of climate change. And so we talked about the destruction of habitats, the way in which the real threats to different environments around the world, and how that has led to the closer contact sometimes between humans and animals, and creating this, kind of pathway for zoonotic diseases. We've also looked at the rise and contestation of expertise. So we looked at sort of, over a course of a couple centuries, how expertise was created and protected and became really important to especially matters of health, but then also how it's recently become really contested. And that's, not unrelated to the history of technology and the sort of digital information age and kind of access to information, of course, but also the spread of misinformation. And we've seen that a lot in this current crisis. And I also think that, we also talked a lot about the lack of preparation, and we looked at, warnings from epidemiologists from just 10 years ago that said, we have these, it's a matter of when this might happen, right? And that and they used history, in fact, to kind of argue for the need to be prepared. And then when it happened, we were still unprepared. So this issue of what is the role of public health, the federal government, and I think also, how society should fund and prepare for such events is also something to look at. And we could keep going. Again, I think that as this evolves, new things are going to become helpful in understanding our present.
Right. Well, and I mean, talk about a time to be teaching your course specifically and to be working in your field when so much is happening right around us, where the work that you do and the teaching that you do speaks directly to it.
Yes.
Carla, Professor Bittel, thanks so much for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. Please join us next week as well, when we'll travel back in time to the ancient world with Professor Mark Anderson. Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks, Carla. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.